as Rich said, we're going to be talking today about the Unified Gateway. If you're not familiar with what this is really something that Citrix has come out with a couple years ago, and it made its debut in the 11.0 version. They've made a couple of enhancements to it in the 11.1 and into the 12.0 version. And so really want to go in and kind of focus on what the Unified Gateway is and what you can go in and do with this and how it's going to simplify some of the things that we do or have done traditionally with the NetScaler. So we'll go in, we'll talk about the Unified Gateway kind of as a whole. Some of you guys have possibly heard about the technology, the endpoint analysis or EPA. We'll go in and talk a little bit about what that is and how you can go in and implement it. We'll talk about portal themes. This is a huge headache in legacy versions. Going in and having to customize the look and feel of a gateway. Now Citrix has made it incredibly easy. There's a lot of things that they've exposed that we can go through the GUI and we can configure. And so makes it really easy for us to go in, put this in place and make this have a custom branded look and feel. We'll talk a little about the different ways that the clients can connect, different things that we might want to go in and take advantage of. And then probably one of the big things that a lot of people want is XenApp and XenDesktop integration. And so we'll go in and take a look at what that entails and then how we can go in and implement that actually pretty easily now using the Unified Gateway. So we'll go in and hit on a couple of these concepts and then we'll jump in and I'll actually show you hands-on what some of this looks like. Okay. So the big thing that Citrix has started pushing is this Unified Gateway concept. And a lot of people have come from the NetScaler Gateway background, where we had the NetScaler Gateway. It provided us a full SSL VPN. We could use it for clientless access. And then if you're a XenApp and XenDesktop guy, the NetScaler Gateway was your mechanism for ICA proxy, remote access to your environment. And while it still does that, the Unified Gateway is actually going to be going a couple steps beyond this. Okay? And so I brought in this diagram here to kind of show the problem that we run into. And the thing is that we've got a lot of different technologies within our environment, and they've all got their own remote access solution. So if you're using XenApp and XenDesktop, you've traditionally got a NetScaler. If you've got some mobile device management platform, it's got its own mechanism. If you're using Citrix, fortunately, that happens to be the NetScaler. If you've got enterprise and SaaS apps or traditional client server apps and things on the back end, there's different remote access technologies that go along with those. And so you wind up with this common theme of I need remote access to something, and then it seems like every single one of those somethings has its own remote access technology. And so you wind up managing 5 or 6 different appliances to go in and handle remote access for 5 or 6 different backend systems. The idea behind the Unified Gateway is let's try to go in and consolidate as many of those as we can into a single remote access platform. And so that's really what they've come up with using this Unified Gateway concept. Okay? So the idea is that you've got a NetScaler, you've got this piece called the Unified Gateway, and then you've got a consolidated access. So you got a single IP, you've got a single FQDN, the users come in, we can do single authentication. So you do authentication at this gateway piece, and then we can pass that through as a single sign-on component to different pieces of the back end. What could that back end be? You'll see in here a couple. You've got your web apps and your SaaS applications there, enterprise apps, Citrix apps. If you're doing XenApp and XenDesktop, traditionally that's what we know the gateway will go in and do. We've got access to that. You've got your mobile applications, other cloud apps that we want to be able to make available. And so we can go in and use a Unified Gateway, bring people in, authenticate them once, and then be able to go in and provide them options for what they get on the back end. That's kind of the underlying driver behind the Unified Gateway. Okay? So what they've done is they've gone and enhanced the traditional NetScaler Gateway by bringing in the unified piece. Gives us a single sign-on capability, gives us a great wizard. If you've worked with the NetScaler Gateway, one of the big things in the past has been that you really need to go in and kind of understand all the moving pieces kind of to a high level of understanding before you can go in and make this work in your environment. Okay? Now, with the Unified Gateway, they've actually put together a very nice wizard. You can go in and say, okay, I want this, answer these questions, and they break it down into 5 basic pieces. Answer the questions, and we can go in and stand this up. And then the more that we know, obviously, the more that we can go in and do with it, but we can actually get this set up conceptually very easily. And then if you're trying to go in and roll this out with XenApp and XenDesktop, Citrix has really done an exceptional job of going in and tying that together to really be able to say, okay, I want remote access. I want remote access for XenApp and XenDesktop. Let's make that happen. Answer some of the questions in the wizard, and it goes in and kind of sets that up for us. So they've done a neat job of being able to finally make that a little bit of a easier and more intuitive process. Yep. And then they've also brought in some other enhancements with it. So the portal themes I've already mentioned, wanting to go in and customize the environment. RDP proxy. Okay, I mentioned that we're going in, we're trying to consolidate some of our remote access. The gateway traditionally gives you clientless access and full SSL VPN and ICA proxy. And if you've got other things that are not Citrix related, then typically you have to use some type of VPN solution. So if you're trying to RDP to some internal resource, you're going to have to go in, set up a VPN into the environment, and then connect to your resource. Citrix now gives you the ability to do RDP proxy. So you can go in and use the clientless access, present a menu of things that you'd like to RDP to, and then be able to dynamically proxy RDP communication in and out of the gateway. Something really neat that they've brought in the 11.0 version. In-factor authentication, being able to go in and authenticate multiple ways. They've expanded some of the SAML integration so we can go in and do some better things with authentication. Probably as we see more of a move to the cloud and you start going in and authenticating some users on site, some users in the cloud, being able to go in and tie in the SAML authentication piece, really going to be kind of a big driver moving forward. And then kind of going after their competitors' solution here. Some of you guys are familiar with VMware. They're obviously the server virtualization experts, but they also have a competitor to XenApp and XenDesktop. So if you're using VMware Viewer, VMware Horizon to get that virtualization concept, what are you doing about remote access? And so they've had a couple of different ways of being able to do remote access to a VMware-based environment. Now Citrix has jumped in and said, if you've got the NetScaler, we can have it go in and be able to provide PC over IP support and be a remote access solution for VMware. And so, like I said, we've got a bunch of different products. We've got a bunch of different remote access solutions. Citrix is really trying to go in, consolidate these down, and be able to make this a easier transition where we've got one place to be able to go in and put these things together. Yep. Now, to go in and roll out the gateway, like I said, it's going to be a very simplified wizard. So what they're going to do is they're going to ask you, how are the users coming in? Usually this is a public IP or some private IP that we've got NATed from a public IP. You've got SSL certificates, obviously, so we can go in and encrypt this data across the internet. Some type of authentication method. So are we going in using LDAP? Are we using Radius? Could be using two-factor authentication, something like that. We've got to have that kind of taken care of. Portal theme, they give us a couple of options here. So instead of just the default that we've had in the past, we've got the default. We've got the ability to make our Unified Gateway look like Storefront version 2. That's called the Green Bubbles theme. Yep. And then if you're using Storefront version 3, you can make the gateway look like that as well. It's called the X1 theme. And then to go in and enhance this even further, what are you putting behind it? And so it says, what apps would you like to make available through the Unified Gateway? And so the wizard will go in and prompt you to see a little bit of what that looks like and be able to deliver, and then it'll give us some options. And I'm going to show you exactly what these look like. So let me actually jump over and show you a Unified Gateway environment. Okay. So this is a lab system in here. You'll see I've got a Xen Center, a lot of my different infrastructure. So I've got a NetScaler stood up, obviously Active Directory in here. I've got an external client to go in and simulate what we're trying to provide, which is obviously remote access. And then some back-end resources. We'll go in and work with Storefront and delivering some XenApp resources. I've got Exchange in here, so I can show you a little bit of what this would look like if I brought in OWA. A couple of things like that to go in and kind of give you an idea of what this is designed to go in and do for us. Okay. So first thing I want to do is go in and look at the NetScaler. So this is the NetScaler. I'm using version 12.0. Okay. So I've got that stood up. I've got a couple of different things already configured. For passing traffic, I've got authentication in place, kind of my bare bones configuration. Okay. What I want to do is I want to go in and expand beyond this and introduce some type of remote access. And that's really where the gateway piece comes into play. And so I want to be able to go in and set up a unified gateway, want to be able to have it be able to do SSL VPN, clientless access, and then eventually ICA proxy. Okay. So in my menu over here, if I expand this out, down here at the bottom, you'll see two things. One, you've got the NetScaler Gateway. This has been around for quite a while. We've used this quite a bit. So for any of you guys that have worked with XenApp and XenDesktop, especially if you've worked with versions 8, 9, 10, you've gone in and set up NetScaler Gateway virtual servers or Access Gateway virtual servers back in the day. And that's where you go in and tell the NetScaler, I'm bringing the user in, this is what I want them to be connected to, and how I want it to work. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to go in and set up a unified gateway. Okay. And just to kind of show you real quickly, there's a little bit of a difference architecture-wise between the two. Okay. Over here on the left, I've got the NetScaler Gateway. That's where we went in and set up a virtual server. We gave it an IP address, users connected to it, and then that's where we controlled authentication, authorization, and how we wanted this thing to behave. Okay. The unified gateway is going to have all sorts of stuff different. And so you've got an IP address, obviously, but it's going to introduce content switching. Okay. What this is this is where we can go in and use policy engines on the NetScaler to identify interesting traffic and send it somewhere. Okay. Traditionally, it's always been able to send it to virtual servers. Here, it's able to go in and send it to a load balancing virtual server or any quantity of load balancing virtual servers and up to one gateway. And so using the unified gateway will look like this. You're still going to get a NetScaler Gateway virtual server, but you'll also get a content switching virtual server. And that'll go in and give you the ability to put this together, move traffic in and out, and be able to control exactly what they want. So what we'll do is we'll go in and kind of do a simplified version of this. This is where we'll go in and say, okay, if you want to do gateway stuff, we send you to the gateway. Okay? And so here's kind of what I'm going to need to answer in my menu. This is what the end result is going to be. Okay? So what I can do is I can jump over here. I can say I'd like to set up a unified gateway. Here, the wizard tells me exactly what I need. I'm going to need IPs. I'm going to need certificates, some type of authentication method, and stuff to have behind here. So I put this in place. Kind of shows you the logical look and feel. Bring users in, send them wherever, mostly to a gateway to authenticate, and then I can have all sorts of stuff on the back end. So to set this up, you'll see 5 steps that I've listed. I probably mentioned this 3 times already. Here they are as part of the menu. Okay? What do I want this thing called? So you just go in and give it a name. Okay? What IP address do I want to use? And so I would have an IP address. In the lab here, just a private IP address. I've got DNS. It'll resolve to that and should make that work. So I go ahead and put this in place. Say that's what I want my gateway to be. It says, okay, it's going to be using SSL. What do you want to do for a certificate? And then I can install certificates and things of that nature. I've already got a wildcard certificate. I'm working in the training.lab domain. Here's a wildcard certificate for that. Okay. So I put that in place. I'm good to go SSL-wise. I've got some different options for authentication. What I'll do is I'll go in and say I want to do LDAP. So LDAP authentication should be fine. Portal theme, I can go in and change this around if I need to. I'll stick with the default here. It'll be the black screen, very traditional. But as needed, I could go in and change that. Okay. And then probably the big piece that we'll get into here in a little bit, applications. What do I want behind this gateway? And then I could go in and hit the little plus sign there and add in applications and be able to make the unified gateway present whatever I want. Okay? So I put this in place, and then it goes in and does all the heavy lifting to create all the pieces that I need. Okay? So what it's going to do is it's going to create a content switching virtual server. So if I come up here, you'll see that I get a content switching virtual server. When users connect, that's what they're getting sent to. It's got a policy that says pretty much hand everybody off to the NetScaler Gateway. So I also get a NetScaler Gateway virtual server. Okay? And so the NetScaler Gateway virtual server is going in and going to actually do pretty much all of our classic gateway experiences. It's also gone in here and created a couple of policies. So it's gone in and created a session policy and a session profile. This goes in and defines how do I want this to behave. Okay? And so they've gone in and got the settings in here. A couple things I'll go in and do. Just because the way the lab environment is set up, if I want to demo the SSL VPN, really need to have split tunnel enabled. So this is going to allow me to go in and connect and still be able to access internal resources. So I can go in and enable split tunnel, very common SSL VPN configuration. If I come down here, I've got a SSL VPN plugin, and I can choose that I want to be able to see that separately from my Citrix receiver. So if you're doing XenApp and XenDesktop, you get a Citrix receiver. If you're doing full SSL VPN, it shows up as a plugin inside of it. Gives me the ability to separate that out and have a little bit more of a standalone SSL VPN piece. Okay. The other thing I've got to watch out for is if I'm doing split tunnel on an SSL VPN, I need to define what is internal versus what is not being sent through the tunnel. So I've got a couple of different policies here. This defines my DMZ network, the 172.21.10 subnet, and this defines my backend network, where all my internal resources are, 192.168.30 subnet. So what I'll do is I'll simply go in and bind these in. This shows me my virtual server, and I'll just jump over here. Here's my intranet applications, and I go in and say what should go through the tunnel is this 172 network. And then I'll also bind in my 192.168.30 subnet. Yep. And so this gives me the inner workings of an environment that I can go in and set up a connection to. Okay? And so I've got a demo system here. This is my external client. Just a basic client, basic web browsers, things like that. I'll open up my Internet Explorer here. And then when I connect to my gateway, this is my NetScaler presenting me a gateway. And so I can go in and use this to be able to log in and access resources. So I've got different users. Remember, I've got a access gateway or an LDAP policy on my gateway. And so I can go in here, log in, and then what it'll do is it'll go in and present me options for how I'd like to connect. Okay? And then this gives me a scenario where I've got full SSL VPN. So if I wanted to go in and connect to internal resources, I could do that. If I wanted to go in and do some clientless access, I could do that as well. Okay? So if I say full SSL VPN, that's this network access, it will offer me a plugin. I've already got that installed. So it should activate my Access Gateway plugin and set up a full SSL VPN connection into my environment. And then I'll be able to go in and VPN in and connect to anything that I want off of the back end. Okay? And so should come up here in a second. I should see, we call this the portal page, should be the 3-column page. And then any resources that I've got access to, it should go in and present those and let me be able to utilize them. Yep. Not sure why it's taken a minute, but down here in my start menu, I've got my Citrix receiver. And then separate from that, I should have my Access Gateway plugin. And then if I wanted to go in and do anything like RDP to a backend resource or something, it would go in and make that possible. And so this gives me a full SSL VPN using my NetScaler. Okay. Now, is that anything new on the NetScaler front? Not really. Okay. We've always had the ability to do full SSL VPN. We've always had the ability to do clientless access. Okay? But what I've got is I've got a nice interface, a nice wizard to go in and put that in place. Okay? What I'm going to do is I'll get out of this. Okay? And so kind of exit out of that. And then what I can do is I can show you kind of the clientless access. Okay? And what I might want to do is I might want to use clientless access. Let's say I want to provide access to internal resources such as OWA. Okay? What I can do is go back and use my unified gateway. Okay? So here's the unified gateway. It shows you I've got one of these guys already set up. What I could do is I could go in and say I've got some internal application that I'd like to be able to present through this unified gateway. And so what I can do is I can come in here and say I'd like to add in an application. It'll then give me options and say, okay, is this an enterprise app or is this a XenApp and XenDesktop? And so I can go in and say, okay, I'd like to provide an enterprise app. Okay, kind of what Exchange is. Okay, specifically, I'd like to work with OWA. And so I'd like the user to be able to come in, see some different apps, click on it, and then have the gateway be able to portal them to OWA. And so I can very easily go in and put this in place. I've got my Exchange server up. So I'll come in here, says, what are we providing access to? And I'll just say OWA. This is going to be clientless access. And it says, what am I going to go in and provide them access to? And then I'll go in and say, connect to. And then that's an internal URL, not something you could connect to across the internet. But when you come into the gateway can proxy you to an internal resource like this. Okay? And so this goes in and says, I should be able to get access to OWA. And so just filling out a simple menu item like this creates a web application. And so now my unified gateway is going to present my users with an option to connect to OWA. Okay? If you want to see what it looks like, I come back here. I got a couple different users. This guy should have an email account here. Okay? So he's going to get presented options here. This time I'm going to do clientless access. So I can do clientless access, and then you'll see that he's got a option here for an enterprise website, and it's got the link to OWA. And then what I can do is I can go in and say, I'd like to provide access to OWA. And then if I've got authorizations on the back end, then they would be able to go and get proxy to it. You'll see that it's going in and giving them a URL up here to be able to go in and give them access to that, to be able to access the back end and be able to connect to the resource. Okay. This guy probably doesn't have authorizations, but I want to go in and take care of that. Very easy to do. I can come down here, create a user account. This is user 1, and give him authorization to pretty much everything. So now he should be able to proxy to the back end and access his email. And so we can go in and use authorizations on the NetScaler to control exactly what somebody gets or doesn't get, whether it's full SSL VPN or clientless access. Now if I come in and try this, same user. Should be able to put this in place and then be able to go in and provide them this experience. Now, may have some type of issue on the back end where the Exchange server is not giving me access, but I can go in and populate that with any type of internal resources, and then they'll be able to go in and pull up that web page. And what it'll even do, if you look at the configuration for this, is it'll even go in and do a single sign-on. So the user has already been authenticated. Okay? And then based off my gateway here on the client experience, I can go in and have this set up to do single sign-on on web applications. So if I put that in place, I can go in and say, when this user authenticates, let's sign them on to the back end. And so the user authenticates at the gateway, and then we pass through that credential to the back end. And so I can go in and put that in place and be able to create a single point of authentication and not have to go in and keep asking them to authenticate every single time they come in. So kind of a couple of nice things that we can go in and do on the from the standpoint of remote access. Okay? I can even do the same things with RDP. So if I wanted to, I can go in and create a, we've got a couple different moving pieces here, but they've got RDP configuration now. This is 11.0 and newer. I can set up what's called the RDP server profile. This is where I go in and define what my gateway is. I can create my client profile to say how they're going to connect. Okay? So generate a RDP file, connect to this gateway, and so on. And then be able to go in and create a session policy and profile to say, I want you to have, and then what we do is we just go in and bind this in. I want the client to behave this way. I want the virtual server. We can come in here, pull up the settings for it, and say I want the virtual server to behave a certain way, like this. Okay. And then all I need to do as an administrator is provide links to whatever I want users to be able to RDP to. And so I can go in and create, we call these bookmarks, but I can come in and create a bookmark for this. And then if I want them to be able to RDP, this is going to be like, I got a domain controller. And this will say RDP to the server. And then what I can do is go in here and say, and then it's ad.train.lab. That's my internal resource. And so I can go in and specify that. And then what will happen is they'll connect to the gateway, and then this will proxy them to the internal resource. I just come in here and say, let's use this as a reverse proxy. They'll connect to the gateway. Gateway will RDP them to the internal environment. And so then if I've got that set up, I can grab a user, like here's an IT admin. I can go in and use this guy. I can say I want him to have that URL. So he gets access to this RDP resource. And then I've got a set of settings that go in and say, I want him to be able to do RDP proxy. And so I come in, bind that in, and that kind of controls exactly how this is going to play out. Okay. Put that in place. And then if you take a look at this from the user standpoint, I can bring in someone like an IT admin. Set them up. They can come in and do clientless access. That means they're not doing full SSL VPN. And then they're provided a link to RDP into the environment. And then what it does is it pulls down a dynamic RDP file. It's going to go in and RDP to the NetScaler. Okay? So you'd actually see it try to set up an RDP connection to my gateway. And then my gateway would proxy them to the backend resource, which is my primary domain controller. And so now, without having to SSL VPN, I can use the unified gateway to provide remote access to resources. Okay? So something new that they've brought in goes in and really does a lot of neat above and beyond stuff. Okay? Now, something else that's really valuable to us is XenApp and XenDesktop. And so anybody that's familiar with that understands the problems that go along with remote access. And so what you get is you get a situation where internal users come in, we build ICA files, we connect them to resources, and life is good. Okay? The problem is that when we bring users in externally, we can't just give them the IP address of an internal resource and have them connect out across the internet. For this reason, we need to go in and use ICA proxy. Okay? Citrix has had many different components that provide that for us. We've used the secure gateway, we use the access gateway. Previously, if that was on the NetScaler, we called it the Access Gateway Enterprise Edition. Now it's the NetScaler Gateway. That is a core component of the Unified Gateway. And so with the Unified Gateway, we've got a NetScaler Gateway present to be able to proxy XenApp and XenDesktop resources in and out of the environment. And so they've gone in and actually made this a lot easier to put in play. Now, in the past, we used to go onto the NetScaler, we used to create session policies and profiles, and then go in and bind those in to say, make this work. And we could go in and do that. Okay? The nice thing is, however, that Citrix has created a really great wizard with the Unified Gateway to go in and simplify that. And so what we can do is we can go in, open up the Unified Gateway, and say that we would like to do, as an application here, XenApp and XenDesktop. And then the Unified Gateway will go in, present us our options to be able to say, how would you like to bring users in? So if you're old school, you might have been using a web interface. The modern way of doing things should be to use a storefront. And so we can go in and say that we're using storefront. Great. It'll then ask us where the storefront server is. Okay. I've got mine load balanced. Sometimes it can go in and detect what your store is. Great. And then if not, you can go in and define it. And so you say, my store is located at that server. You put this in place here. One thing, if you notice when I logged in, it asked me for a username and password. Storefront traditionally asks for a username, password, and domain. And so here it wants me to kind of fill in what's missing. So I go in and fill in the training domain. Yep. I need to involve the STAs for remote access. These are my controllers. So I can add in one of those. Okay. So I've got two controllers in the environment. I can say go use one or the other. I should put that in place and say, okay, here's what we're going to do remote access wise. And then it has set me up to go in and allow users to connect to the back end. And what it's done is it's gone in and created the policies and the profiles to make this happen. So if you go in and look, here's the NetScaler Gateway. Here's the session policies. And so it's created one. This is for if the user is using a Citrix receiver. This is if they're not using a Citrix receiver. And then these settings that go along with that. Okay. Client experience, single sign-on of web applications, give them the allow authorization, and then let's do ICA proxy. And then it fills in exactly how to get to the back end. Okay. And then on top of that, it's gone in and told my NetScaler, specifically the NetScaler virtual server, where the actual back end is to be able to go in and talk to the STAs. And so it goes in and tells it, here's where we redeem our tickets. Okay. Only other thing I need to go in and do is actually to tell my storefront environment that I'm using remote access. And so you can go in and kind of see that here. What you do is you go in and set up authentication to say that users are authenticating at a gateway. So I go in and specify users can authenticate at a gateway. It'll go in and set up storefront to be able to handle remote users coming in. Yep. And then I just need to tell it where this gateway is. So as soon as my screen unfreezes, maybe it will go in and let me change this. Maybe. Okay. What I need to do is I'll go in, I'll tell it that user coming through a gateway, and then over here on the left, you'll see that it's got a spot for the gateway, and I'll go in and tell it exactly what that gateway is. Okay. And so it will want to know where these gateways are that users are coming in with. I'll need to tell it about my unified gateway, which is gateway.training.lab. It will also need to know about the STAs, and I'll tell it about the two STAs that I just put in place. And then it'll be able to go in and use that to be able to bring users in remotely and connect to my environment. And so if I come in here, users are coming into HTTPS. Here, if I want to go in and do some advanced stuff where I can do the endpoint analysis, scan the end user device, make sure they meet certain criteria, the storefront needs to know how to get back to that gateway. Whoops. And put that in place. It asks about the STAs. I've only got one powered on, so one will work. And then it's somewhat good to go. It kind of knows that I've got remote access, and then all I need to do is really tell it that I want users to be able to come in remotely. And so what I'll do is I'll go back to my store. The store by default is set up for internal access only. I'll just need to simply go in and tell it that I want users to be able to come in remotely. And then by doing that, that's going to allow my gateway to hand users off to this storefront. And then it's going to allow this storefront to go in and know how to create ICA files to bring users in to this gateway. And then if I had multiples of these, my final step would go in and be to tell them I want to do propagate my settings from one server to the other. So kind of as a final piece here, if I want my end user to go in and get some resources. Yep. Previously, you saw network access, clientless access. I mentioned RDP, showed you how that works. Now I've got virtual apps and desktops. Yep. And so what I can do, bring in the virtual apps and desktops. I'm getting proxied from the gateway to storefront. And then storefront is going in, enumerating my resources for me, like it would for an internal user, but it's going to go in and display my resources and then allow me to be able to remotely access them from outside the environment. And so what will happen is it'll display my resources. I'll say I want to launch an application. Storefront will build an ICA file a little bit differently and tell me connect to your gateway. And then it will connect to the gateway. It'll involve what we call a secure ticket authority for remote access. And then when it comes back in, it'll present that ticket to the gateway. The gateway will be able to find out exactly where my session is on the back end. And then I'll be proxying ICA through my NetScaler. Okay. The only other thing that I might want as a part of this is some valuable reporting functionality. Okay. And so this is where you might run into what's called Insight Center. Okay. Some of you guys might be familiar with the MAS appliance. Okay. MAS appliance stands for Management and Analytics. A lot of valuable information to be gained from using the NetScaler for web traffic, SSL traffic, and obviously ICA traffic. And so we've got a very valuable component called the Insight Center. And what the Insight Center allows us to do is to go in and look at the valuable information passing through the NetScaler. Okay. And so this lets me go in and see the different entities that are on my NetScaler. Okay, so here's a bunch of load balancers. What I might be concerned with is the gateway. And so I can go in and say, I would like gateway information. I go in and configure this, and then this sets up my NetScaler to grab valuable statistics, dump them off to this Insight Center, and be able to allow me to go in and analyze what is going through my gateway. Okay? I've got access to what's called Web Insight. So if I'm doing hosting of web sites and things like that, I might want to know what my traffic flow statistics are looking like and such. We've now got Gateway Insight for SSL VPN. So what are we talking about traffic-wise there? I've also got, obviously, ICA. And then for the guys that are joining us from the class I'm teaching this week, we've been talking about the app firewall, okay? Security assessment and a threat assessment. And so Security Insight can give you some valuable information about what is happening within the environment. So I'm not really going to see my traffic flow statistics. It's going to take a while to actually update, but I could go in and see round trip times. I could see bandwidth. I can see all of my users. I can see my ICA channel. So how much my bandwidth is, screenshots, printer redirection, clipboard redirection, and so forth. So very, very valuable tool as a part of my management capability. And if you know how this works, you can go in and set up your Insight Center to be able to get you valuable statistics off of your NetScaler about this traffic flows that I just mentioned. Okay? And then if you're doing XenApp and XenDesktop, part of your management tool is the Director product. And so we're using that to already manage XenApp and XenDesktop. Okay? And then what we can do is we can tie these together so that when you're using the Director product, you can see what the user is connected to on the back end and be able to go in and see what they're connected to going through the NetScaler as well. So it gives me the big picture of what's the client is connecting from, what they connected to, and all the networking information that the NetScaler is exposed to. So very, very powerful tool. Both of these are powerful tools as standalone products. Okay? However, the integration with Director and Insight or Director and the MAS appliance really takes this up a couple notches. Really lets us go in and see some valuable things to be able to implement a scenario to give us the big picture about a little bit of everything going on within the environment. Okay? So I know that kind of gets us to the end of our time together. There's a million other things that we can go in and talk about with the NetScaler. It's actually got so much functionality baked into it. There's a lot of really neat things that you can do, especially with XenApp and XenDesktop. You can go in and tie in with the pre-authentication capabilities and determine, do we want a device in or not? Or we can even go in and discriminate those capabilities. So I could look and see, are you a corporate issue PC? You get one set of apps. If you're not using a corporate issue PC, I could whittle that down to some less secure apps or even restrict your behaviors. So a lot of functionality when we combined XenApp and XenDesktop with the NetScaler. So, Rich, I'll turn it over to you, and if we've got a little bit of time and you want to field questions, we can go in and do that.
Okay, Matthew, thank you very much. Great job. So we have a few questions specifically regarding RDP, and so the first question is regarding the RDP proxy. Does it require you to enable an RDP role on the backend servers?
Good question. Yes. Okay. Normally these would be servers that you'd be able to RDP to if you could connect to them directly. So if I can see the IP address and I can RDP to it, great. RDP is going, or the RDP proxy is going to expose that across the internet. So as long as I've got that functionality enabled on the back end that I could RDP to the server, then I could do the RDP proxy. Obviously, if the server is locked down and I can't RDP to it, RDP proxy isn't going to help me.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Okay, there's another question about what course is available for this, for some of this content. So
great question.
Yeah.
Oh, do you want to go that?
No, go ahead, Matthew. You can take that.
Okay. If you're familiar with the NetScaler training, we've actually had kind of two flavors of this. We've had NetScaler more for the traditional networking side, kind of the CNS 220 class. I know a lot of you guys may have taken that, and so they actually do offer a 2-day add-on. It's called the CNS 221. Specifically relates to the Unified Gateway. So exactly what I showed you, setting up, controlling it, tying it in with Exchange, RDP, XenApp and XenDesktop, all of that. If you're not necessarily that familiar with the NetScaler, there's a full-blown 1-week class that's going to go in and cover core NetScaler essentials and add to the end of it everything you need to know about the Unified Gateway that I've explained here. So kind of two options there, just depending on whether you've been exposed to the NetScaler or if you kind of need a little bit more fundamental knowledge.
Thanks, Matthew. And then there's a follow-up question to that about NetScaler MOS training.
Okay, awesome. The guys that are joining from my class this week, they're in the advanced NetScaler class. It's actually made up of kind of two pieces. The first 3 days we talk about the app firewall, and so some of the security functionality of the NetScaler. And then the last 2 days, one of the big pieces there is going to be the MAS appliance. And so we go in and we actually look at how do you manage a NetScaler, how do you control the NetScaler, how do we monitor it, and then how do we get those valuable analytics that I mentioned. And so The last 2 days of that advanced class, Rich has probably got the specific course number for that, but there's 2 days in there, and half of that time is spent with the MAS appliance.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's the CNS 319, Matthew.
Okay.
So the app firewall is the 318, and the MAS portion is the 319. Okay, and then there's a follow-up to the RDP topic. And this is the question: can I provide a smart destination for RDP to pull the managed host from AD for the user, and then the user doesn't need to remember their host name?
Not necessarily. It's not necessarily as dynamic as what we see with ICA proxy. You do a whole XenApp and XenDesktop config, and then ICA proxy is NetScaler hands it off, and Storefront knows what your resource is. It has to be a little bit more static. I can still go in and create a dynamic or a static mapping. So if I know what your resource is, I can bring in your user or your group and then provide you those bookmarks. And so my NetScaler can do the dynamic one-to-one relationship, not necessarily anything on the back end that can go and provide that.